While I was working on the video for my meditation on the Three of Swords, I was struck by the shape of the sword hilts, and I was wondering myself what exactly they could symbolize. So, I get to spend a rainy day inside with newly sharpened pencils, contemplating the meaning of focused will or intent and how it relates to the suit of swords in the minor arcana. So while I was examining the swords drawn by Pamela Colman Smith in the suit of swords in the Rider-Waite Smith Tarot, one thing I looked at was the length of the blades in the cards. I was looking to see if there was some kind of universal constant, such as a golden mean or something similar. So what I found, for example, in Queen of Swords was if we took the hilt to the pommel as the kind of like the unit of measurement, in the Queen of Swords, the entire sword she's holding is 7 units long. 7 relating to Venus, I think, is quite apt for the Queen of Swords. But in the Ace of Swords, using again the hilt as the standard of measurement, the sword total is only 4 units, aptly reflecting, as we can see here, the 4 worlds of the Tree of Life. One thing I've noticed in the orientation of the swords, if the sword in the card is oriented point downwards, hardly ever is it held by anyone in the suit. Whereas with the sword upright, the point of the sword upwards, it is usually held in hand by someone, starting with the Ace of Swords. To begin with, as in the Three of Swords, where all of the swords are point downwards, we could look upon it in the Tree of Life as the pommel being 1, or keter. The hilt is actually 2 and 3, Chachma and Binah, combined together with Dath, by the way, the hidden Sephiroth, to create the hilt of the sword, which is in effect held by the divine. The guard of the sword consists of Chesed and Gevurah forming the guard. Then the Rakasa of the sword is formed by Tifareth. The edges of the sword are formed by Netzach and Hod. And then here 9 Yesod with the point 10. Then, with the sword upright, we have Malkut as the pommel, Yesod as the grip of the hilt, and then we have Hod and Netzach forming the guard. Remember, this is now wielded by focused human will. We have Tifareth as the Rakasa of the sword. The edge of the sword is made up of Chachma and Chesed combined together, and on this side we have Binah and Gevurah combined together. So that's 4 plus 2 is 6, and then 5 plus 3 is 8. The tip of the sword is keter. Although the downward pointing swords represent forces that are beyond the querent's control, I think it's more important, especially for the the neophyte or the initiate to find out how to grasp the sword themselves. And I think a good key to that can be found in a subject I've talked before, the microprosopis, or the lesser face. Now, one thing I did pay close attention to while working on investigating this was the shape, the form of the hilt itself. And all of the swords have this basic hilt. Now, one difficulty I had in dealing with the lesser face, also known as the Shekinah, here was the assignment of the elemental values to these 5 Sephiroth. And I found conflicting examples in the references I checked. So I decided to hearken back to my meditation on the magician that I did a short while ago, where I determined that thanks to the sequence of the 4 suits in his text, Waite's Text Pictorial Key to the Tarot, I was able to come up with an arrangement of the 4 elements that seemed to match what was going on in his magician card, particularly the way the elemental objects were arranged on a table before the wizard. And so as a result, we have fire here in 10 for Malkut. We have water here at 9 for Yesod. We have air for Hod and earth for Netzach. And so, applying these principles, or these elements, pardon me, they are principles, but that's another thing. Applying these elements to the lesser face here, we then, looking at it in terms of a sword hilt held up with the blade upwards, we have the pommel is fire, which kind of makes sense. The fire is kind of like the motivations for why we do something. Remember, the sword is focused will. And then we have water for the hilt. It is difficult at times to take a full grasp of what we need to do or what we have to do. Combined for the guard of earth and air, which to me, particularly as someone who does practice swordsmanship, the idea of blending earth and air makes sense, where the guard or the hilt is something you either oppose, directly oppose to your opponent, or using air, you use it to redirect or misguide your opponent's attack against you. And with the Rakasa consisting of ether or Tefareth, which is then the lens for the focused will of the blade. Whether the sword blade is pointed down or the sword blade is pointed up, I think what we're dealing with here is what's known as the cross of matter. And so what's important is, how do we properly take hold of it to properly use the focused will, the intent? Part of that, I think, can be addressed through what is known as the lesser face, or the microprosopis of the Tree of Life. In my studies of using the sword for self-defense, one thing that I came to appreciate is the sword doesn't care who holds it. I've had numerous discussions where people try to tell me that women can't handle swords, or that, somebody who is not a cis white male can't handle a sword, and my response has always been to shrug and say, the sword doesn't care. When we combine the idea that the sword doesn't care, with the Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, it becomes important who takes hold of the sword. Because we need to keep in mind that whatever we project upwards, whatever our force of intent is, we are nevertheless encountering an even greater will, an even greater intent that at times we can only dimly catch a glimpse of. And so the intent and purpose for taking hold of the sword becomes vitally important. For example, in the Ace of Swords, the hand that takes hold of the hilt of the sword is a pure white. In this case, the pure white refers to a spiritual purity. So whoever takes up the sword must be absolutely clear on what their motivations and intentions are and what it is they're trying to achieve. So when we speak of a sword that is both, just a moment, that is both upright and inverted, the point up and the point down, and we see that this is something, a quality that is shared both by humans and by the divine. Although this is pointing downwards, it can be pointing up, but that would point up into worlds, Ein Sofer and so forth, that we can't even begin to understand. I mean, even at this point here, we can only dimly perceive the mind and will of the divine, of this higher power. However, this sword can be inverted here. Let's get things slightly rearranged. Thank you. Okay. I was talking about how every suit has its benefits, has its obligations, and has its requirements. If the hand takes hold of the sword for the wrong reasons, or the wrong hand is holding the sword, then the sword can be also inverted into a dark tree, kind of a mirror. If this is the regular tree, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, then this here is a tree of darkness. And as we can see, the sword can be extended downward, and the will and the intent can be directed to a wrong purpose and a wrong goal, and quite possibly bring misery and suffering to the world and to the person holding the sword. So we have to remember, one of the lessons of the swords in the Minor Arcana is intent is all.